Okay, let's be honest. We have all been there. You feel totally 100% prepared for a huge test or a big presentation, and then you get there and realize you really weren't. Well, today we're going to break down the science of how to get better at knowing what you actually know.
Ah, it's that sinking feeling, right? You put in the hours, you felt super confident, but then the moment of truth comes and your mind just goes completely blank. Look, this isn't just some bad luck. It's a very specific problem. And the good news is, it's a solvable one. There's actually a scientific term for this. It's called monitoring accuracy. And it's really just a fancy way of saying how good you are at judging your own learning. So if there's this huge gap between how well you think you know something and how well you actually perform, well, that means your monitoring accuracy is pretty low. I love this analogy. Think of it like you have this internal learning compass. If that compass isn't calibrated right, you're just going to end up sailing in circles. You'll waste time studying stuff you already know and completely miss the things where you're actually lost. So, calibrating this compass, that is the absolute key to learning efficiently and effectively. All right, so let's dig into the core issue here. We can call it the self-awareness problem. Because it turns out most of us are, well, we're surprisingly bad at judging how good we are at things. So, the million-dollar question is, can we actually fix this? Can we get better at it? Well, luckily for us, a team of researchers decided to find out. They went and dug through a ton of data to find strategies that are actually proven to work. And this wasn't just some small side project. This led to a massive, and I mean massive, scientific search for a fix. We are definitely not talking about one small, isolated experiment here. Get this, they analyzed the results of 35, that's 35, separate scientific studies. This was no casual glance, it was a super deep, systematic investigation into what really works when it comes to learning. What they did is called a meta-analysis. It's a really powerful research technique where you combine the results from lots of different studies to get a much clearer, much more reliable picture of what's going on. And their goal was super simple: figure out which learning strategies actually make us better at judging ourselves. Okay, so what did this huge analysis actually find? This is the good part. Let's look at the results. What helps, and maybe even more importantly, what actually hurts. So across all those 35 studies, the researchers calculated what's called an effect size. It's basically just a number that tells you how much of an impact these strategies had. And the number they landed on was G equals 0.25. So what on earth does that number mean in plain English? Well, it means that overall, these strategies have a small but definitely positive effect. The takeaway here is awesome. We can get better at this stuff. It's not a lost cause. But this is where it gets really fascinating. Because it turns out not all strategies are created equal. Not even close. The researchers found 3 types of interventions that totally had a positive effect. But, and this is a big but, they also found one that had a negative impact. It's something they called timing of judgment. Yeah, let's just pause on that for a second. The study explicitly found that this one specific type of intervention made things worse. This is a huge, huge surprise, mainly because it flies in the face of some really common study advice you hear all the time. So what does that even mean in practice? It means that those common techniques, like waiting a little while before you guess how well you did on something, or being asked to constantly rate your confidence level, they didn't just fail to help. They actually made it harder for students to know what they knew. They were actively harmful. Wild, right? But okay, the story doesn't end there. The findings also came with some really important details. The effectiveness of these strategies, well, it wasn't the same for everybody. This is definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. When you look at the data, you see these strategies were actually pretty effective for younger primary school kids and for adults. But do you see that dip right in the middle? Yeah, they were the least effective for secondary school students. For teenagers, for some reason, something just wasn't clicking. So, why that dip for teens? Well, the researchers have a pretty solid theory. They think it might be linked to that well-documented decline in motivation for school that often happens during those teenage years. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're not really motivated to learn in the first place, it's going to be way harder for these kinds of thinking about thinking strategies to stick. And what about the real world? Does this stuff actually work outside of a lab? Well, as you'd probably expect, the effects were bigger and cleaner in a controlled lab setting. But, and here's the really good news, Even in messy, unpredictable, real-world classrooms, the strategies that worked still had a clear positive effect. So yes, they actually work in practice. All right, so after digging through all that data, what's the big takeaway for us? What can we actually do to become better, more effective learners?
It really boils down to 3 winning strategies. These are the tried and true, research-backed ways to finally calibrate that learning compass of yours and get a much more accurate sense of what you really know. So let's break them down real quick. First, whole task. This just means focusing on the big picture, on deep understanding. So for example, creating a concept map instead of just mindlessly rereading your notes. Second is metacognitive knowledge. This is all about thinking about how you think, literally asking yourself, what's my process for solving this problem? And finally, external standards. This one's simple. Check your work against something reliable, like an answer key or the official grading rubric. And all of this brings us to a final question for you. Now that you know that some really common study strategies might actually be hurting you more than they help, and you also know the ones that are proven to work, what's the very first change you're going to make to your own learning strategy?